Hello, thank you for coming. If you didn't notice, there are copies of the budget that are on the music stand right there if you want to grab one. My name is Nell Hazlitt. I am your elected treasurer, and I serve on the Finance Advisory Committee. Our committee, along with the staff and the Board of Trustees, are recommending the following budget to the congregation. I just want to, recall upon this past year, which has been kind of a remarkable one for our church as we embarked on the capital campaign journey to eliminate our debts and realize some of our biggest dreams. We called this campaign Embracing Our Future, and it's echoed throughout DUUC, not only through the generosity of this congregation to give to the church, but as the ethos of who we are as a community. We are embracing our future through the continued investments we're making in ourselves, whether that's our membership program, religious education programming for adults and children, or in our ongoing transition to policy-based governance. We are at the threshold of another year where we, as the board, are continuing to commit to the future of this church, and you will see that reflected in our budget. This is one of those moments that Rev Mandy referred to as looking from the balcony. As we look toward our 1 year, our 3 year, our 5 year future, we're making thoughtful decisions about where to spend with the ultimate goal of freeing up all of our debts, growing our congregation, and bringing to life our big dreams. So before we get to the next year, I want to update you on our current year finances. I'm going to throw a lot of numbers out there, so I'm going to try and be as clear as possible. Right now, we're trending to receive somewhere between 90 to 95% of our expected pledges for the year. That would equate to somewhere between $25,000 to $50,000 that was pledged but not received, which is obviously more than we want. Luckily, we still have the month of June to make sure we have gotten all our pledged amounts in, so this is also a call to action. Now, this year's budget, so 2023-2024, when it was passed, projected a deficit of $56,000. So if you were here last year, that's what you saw. The congregation at the time passed this deficit budget with a vote to allow us to borrow up to $60,000 from the endowment funds. Right now, those endowment funds contain $398,000. At this time, your leadership has decided not to borrow from endowment, and instead it will absorb that cost into the general fund, for which we have the funds to cover the currently projected deficit of $40,000. Again, that's $16,000 less than anticipated. We'll update you if the projected deficit number changes significantly or if the recommendation to cover the deficit from the general fund changes. Finally, before we get into next year's budget, I'm pleased to share that when it comes to the capital campaign, we have already received a significant amount of payments, around $310,000, and we are investing them in an insured interest-bearing account prior to recasting our mortgage later this August. And I'm going to share a little bit more about that when we talk about our mortgage expenses. So with that, I'd like to share with you the detail of our budget for the year 2024-2025. On the next two slides, you're going to see the first column representing the budget for the current 2023-2024 year, the second column representing actuals as of March 31st, and the third column representing our proposed budget for 2024-2025. When we look at pledges, they're made up of three categories: what people have pledged, what people who pledged last year and paid regularly but have not yet pledged this year, what we expect from them, and then what we expect to collect from new members. So as you can see, we still expect that there are people who are going to pledge, and if everybody were to do so, we would meet and probably exceed what we had for pledges received last year, but we would like to see that number a little bit higher. As it relates to offerings, we have continued over the past couple of years to see increases in free will offerings, so we've increased our expectations again this year. You'll see in the facilities rental that we've reduced our expected income because last year we had an additional $3,000 from Musa, who rented our facilities for 3 days in July, and we're not going to have that this year. Another thing you'll notice is that our auction was wildly successful this past year, and while we would love to see that again, we've only slightly increased our revenue, so we'll see if the auction committee can make that magic happen again. Now, one other thing you'll notice is that last year We thought we were going into the year with a $15,000 in surplus, and in reality, that should have been a deficit of $14,000. So that is different than what you would have seen last year. But again, we're always having this meeting before the last month, or before we've received all of our pledges. So it's always a projection of what our deficit is going to be. Now, and I'm going to open it up to questions at the end. I'm just going to keep going through so we get through everything. The personnel expenses, you'll notice an increase, and there are two major sources of the increase in personnel expenses. First was a COLA increase for most staff of 3.4%. Last year, we only did a 1% increase, and this year we decided to keep pace with inflation. Second, we had two staff who were significantly under what we would call what we call the midpoint of fair compensation as recommended by the UUA. We have brought those salaries into alignment with midpoint because we believe it is the right thing to do, and it will continue to keep DUUC competitive as an employer. As always, we budget for the highest possible expense as it relates to healthcare coverage for our staff. Not all of our staff actually uses the UUA healthcare, so we generally spend less than is budgeted, but we have to budget for the case where all of our staff would. So when you see that $461,000, in all likelihood, that's actually about $420,000, but we have to budget for the higher end. One thing you'll see that looks lower actually is our mortgage expenses. So like I said, we're going to complete a recast of our mortgage in the fall, which will significantly reduce our monthly payments. Right now, we're expecting to do a recast in September or August, and starting to realize the lower monthly payment in September. But those of you who indicated in your capital campaign promise that you'd be contributing in 2024, you're going to be receiving a letter and a survey in the next month to help us pinpoint when we can expect that payment so that we better understand how much that recast will be. So this budget actually reflects 3 months of current payment plus 9 months at a reduced monthly payment. And that's based on a recast of $400,000 to $500,000. That number could be greater, again, depending on what the survey tells us. And we're hoping, again, if we do it in August, we'd actually start realizing the lower monthly payment in September. So that number could be even lower in reality. Finally, you'll see under organizational dues, this UUA annual program fund. We increased our pledge this year by another $5,000 in our journey to reaching our honor congregation status. Next year, we'll increase by another $5,000, and we should reach this status by the end of next year. We've added some funds to our membership programs. Under Worship and Inspiration, we need to start saving for a ministerial sabbatical fund when this happens in the next few years. And under Education and Personal Growth, we have added funds for leadership development and for a visioning task force. So you'll see there at the bottom a couple numbers. Next year's budget projects a deficit of $89,000, which is actually more likely going to be $48,000, with the expectation that we will have staff who will not utilize the UUA health insurance. So that's where that $89,000 is based on $461,000 personnel expenses, and the $48,000 deficit is based on $420,000 personnel expenses, which is the more likely. It's important to note that if we were to eliminate our debt, we would probably not have a deficit at all. And as you heard, we're on track to eliminate a substantial portion of our debt in the first year, and we're looking to create a timeline of when we look to pay everything down. So these two slides represent our proposed 2024-2025 budget, and yeah, I'd like to open the floor for questions. Yeah.
Do we have reserves that would cover the deficit?
Yeah, you're gonna get the, yeah. So the question was, do we have reserves that would cover the deficit? So as of right now, we have $100,000 in our general fund, and with the projected deficit of $40,000, we'll have $60,000 left in there, right? So it's possible that next year we'd be requesting, borrowing from endowment funds if we felt that we needed it. But as of right now, we're going to see if we are able to cover that with the general fund. And we're going to see, again, if we're able to reduce our mortgage payments, it's potential that that deficit would be even lower than it is up there right now.
Thank you.
If we're borrowing from the endowment fund, is there provision to be paying that back maybe when we get the mortgage down?
So that would be a decision to make when if and when we decide that we'd want to borrow. If we borrow, we would pay it back. If we decide we just want to take from there, we wouldn't need to pay it back. So that's a decision that we'd make in the future. But again, we have some folks working on the endowment fund this next year, figuring out, do we want to continue having the same requirements that we've had in the past? But again, that would be a decision for us to make in the future if and when we decide that we need to take money from endowment, which we don't right now.
Has there been any discussion of increasing the amount for marketing, since I think it continues that we're kind of a secret place here and not everyone knows about this opportunity? But I think $700 wouldn't go very far in getting out there and letting people know about us.
Right. So I can't speak directly to that. What I can say is that this budget was made with the staff. So this was based on the recommendations of Tina, our membership director. And so, you know, if she feels that's sufficient, that's what we've requested. I will say that the investment in a membership director itself is, you know, a significant investment, but it's one that has already started to show that not only are we getting new members, but when the year after that they start, they've been pledging more than we even expected. So we're starting to see realization there. I'll remind everybody that it takes about 3 to 5 years to start to see the real ROI on a membership director. But so I can't really necessarily speak to the marketing line item itself, just that was what was recommended by our membership director.
It has been a discussion for many meetings. Yes, we are talking about it. And we also need staff time to be able to devote to actually making marketing happening. And that we don't have time at the moment. But that doesn't mean we have nothing planned. It just means we have to be judicial in how we do it. So yes, I would expect to see that in a request for an increase in the coming years. Make sense?
I think I can be loud enough. Could you just speak to how many new members? Wait a second.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's Zoom people.
Could you speak to how many new members have joined the DUC over the last year, just to give us a point of reference?
I think that's something actually Mandy might be better.
We've had 36 new members join. 33 are still new members as of this date. So we will, in 2 weeks on New Member Sunday, we will welcome 33 new members. I'm getting my steps in today.
What is the endowment fund and why do we have it? What is it used for, will be used for? Being a new member, I'm curious.
Yeah, you know, I'll start to answer that, but I think Anne.
It's probably.
But right now we have $398,000, as I said, which is even a significant increase from last year. We have $8,000 that we're making available for endowment projects. And so maybe keep those two numbers in mind, because that kind of speaks to what the purpose of the endowment fund is and why we're potentially looking at it.
So the endowment fund here at this church was started back in the 1990s. And I think the original intent was to just make sure that if there was any sort of high-level, important, nearly catastrophic event, that we would have a fund to draw from. And in fact, that is kind of the current wording of our endowment fund, which is why we are only allowed to draw from investment income And then that is shared with the church, and it usually is just a few $1,000s a year for projects that aren't in the operating, haven't been listed in the operating fund. What we're trying to do is take a look at that original intent and perhaps broaden what we can use, as we've just been saying, in order to borrow, or in order to use any of that money to cover a deficit. We had to vote to borrow the money last year. We're not going to use it. There will be another motion at this coming annual meeting to borrow to possibly cover the 24-25 budget. Again, that would be borrowing, and the board won't have a plan to repay it until and unless we use that money. We're not using it this year. We'll vote to kind of re-up that borrowing next year. But in the meantime, as Nell said, the Finance Committee is going to be looking at the way other churches use their endowments. There are a million different ways that churches use their endowments, but if we can free up a little bit more of that money for occasional use to cover something like we're hiring a new membership director who is going to bring in 36 new members a year, and those sorts of things, instead of having to repay that, we will understand that the money that we use from the endowment is actually helping the church grow, and that money will be recovered in so many different ways. So at the moment, we have quite a restrictive endowment that essentially says, when everything is just about to completely fall apart, then you can use endowment. That's really not going to help us. We're going to look at what we can do in the future to relax that a bit in terms of what makes sense. But the hope also is that more people might then leave legacy gifts to endowment if they understand that that money is just not going to sit there forever and a day, but will be used for projects that will grow the church over time.
I'm coming.
Ken, I hope that you have a question that you're going to answer yourself. He's on our Finance Committee.
I believe the current endowment from the beginning would allow the board to go to the congregation and ask for a congregational vote to use the funds. So I think right now, if the board wanted to use the funds for whatever purpose, if the congregation agreed with them, that could be done.
You're right.
You are right.
You're right, Ken. And because of I think we have used the borrowing terminology because of the high level of anxiety over changing how we're using endowment. But you're absolutely right. We do not just have to borrow. We could say that we would take. You're right. But in the future, perhaps we can create a policy around that does make it less onerous to even suggest that to the congregation. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
Yep. As it currently stands, yeah. Other questions?
It sounds like our insurance costs went up 30%. Is that typical for?
Oh, our insurance.
So I can answer that
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
So beginning last August, I started seeing in Facebook threads of UU ministers that insurance companies were dropping churches completely. And when they weren't dropping insurance, they were increasing it by 200 or 300%. So I started panicking a little bit because we do not need that hitting our budget at all. And so Sherry and I did some digging into our insurance company, asked them for a quote, and that's what happened. Now, if you know from your own personal insurance, homeowners insurance has gone up drastically, especially if you live in states where climate change is happening. But for churches, that has been even worse of a situation, especially if you live in places where there's climate change, but also in places like Texas where there have been shootings in churches, right? We are so lucky that that's all it went up. There were churches that were paying $12,000 one year, and then the bill came in at $55,000. Yeah, we don't need that. And a lot of churches whose buildings were over 50 years old were dropped completely from Church Mutual, which is the #1 insurance company that insures churches. So we are lucky. I am not sharing our insurance company with anybody else because nobody else needs to know about our lovely little secret here. But that is, yes, so it did increase, like probably your own homeowner's insurance did, but we got really darn lucky. Other questions? You're good.
I don't see funds listed on here. I know they're not budget items, but for example, the endowment fund, what's in it, and the one that I interact with is the retreats fund, which is, of course, much smaller, but people might like to know what is in those funds.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have, they're not endowments, we have an endowment fund, yes, but we also have restricted funds, you're correct. We've got, I think, a flower fund and something with youth
Smile.
ministry and whatnot. You are welcome to contact Sherry in the office if you want that information. Right now, we're just talking about operating budget. Yeah, because that's the only thing we vote on, right? We don't vote on those other funds.
This is a very specific question, but I'm just wondering with the increase in the insurance costs, have we increased rent, like the rent expense for facility rental?
So we talked a little bit about rental prices for our facility, and the usage is really by smaller groups, AA, Youth Outlook. So we have actually decided, and we compared to places like the Park District, how much do they charge? And what we decided is that we want to keep it accessible, so we have not changed our what we charge.
We will look at the rental rates again. It's on Sherry's gigantic to-do list. But yeah, it's kind of that weird position because we're a church, people come to us, and AA is a ministry, as is Youth Outlook, and we can't charge them an exorbitant fee, right? Because they are nonprofits like we are, and they do ministry just in a different way. So it's a weird tangle, right?
Well, if you have questions, you can reach out to treasurer@dupageUUchurch.org. That's right. I'm also going to be doing a Zoom version of this on Wednesday night, and we'll be voting on this on June 2nd. So thank you, everybody, for coming and caring so much about your church.